Hello, welcome back. I am so happy to be here chatting to you today. It feels like it's been ages when in fact it's only really been a couple of weeks since I last spoke to you. I did decide to have 2 weeks off the podcast so that I could spend a bit of time with my family over the summer, focus on my members inside the app. And that is what I've done. The fact about spending time with my family is that I have teenage boys and there's only a limited amount of time that they want to spend with their mother. But we have done some bits. Yeah, last week we went to a giant slip and slide. That was great fun. My youngest and me went to Boscastle, to the farm shop there, and had a little walk. That was lovely. We also went and saw the eclipse from the local sports field. And while it was really nice, I remember the eclipse from 1999. And I feel like that one was a lot more impressive because it is amazing how much sunlight is still produced from 5% of the sun, isn't it? But anyway, we did that. We had the glasses on. I was trying to take pictures on my phone through the other thing that came with the glasses, and that was somewhat unimpressive. And then I think I've picked what could be a more than normal amount. It could be borderline obsession with picking blackberries. I have picked so many. And actually, at the time that this recording goes out, there will be one of my favorite breakfast recipes that I've created, my blackberry crumble pancake bowl. It's so good. I love it, especially served with a bit of yogurt. Anyway, highly recommend you give that a try. I will try and remember to link the reel in the show notes so you can go and give that a look. But because I haven't been recording the podcast, and I also closed the doors for membership over the August period, we're opening our autumn intake at the end of the month. It has meant that I've also got a bit more brain space. And part of that could also be to do with the fact that my teenagers don't really want to spend every minute of every day with me. And so I have found myself doing a bit more baking, doing my runs as normal, but actually getting a bit of time to myself, which is crazy, weird. And that has meant that I have actually had more creative ideas than perhaps I would have at other times. And I've been listening to a few books, and I know I've said this before, but often my inspiration for podcasts will come from conversations I've had with people, from books I've listened to, from conversations with family, or a combination of all of them. And actually, this podcast episode, I remember I was picking blackberries in the garden. I was listening to yet another book, and it was linking back to another book that I'd read recently. And it got me really thinking. So I'm going to explain that a little bit more now. So the books that I've been listening to at the moment, I'm just finishing off Happy by Darren Brown. I also listened to The Antidote by Oliver Burkeman and Do Hard Things by Steve Magnus. Now, none of these books are about fat loss or fitness, and not one of them is about how we set goals. But that is where my mind kept going when I was listening to all three of them at different points. They kept making me think about the way that we do go about making changes. Now, that is kind of essentially what they do talk about throughout them. But those of you that have been listening to me for a while will know that I talk a lot about setting goals and then putting our attention into the actions, the things that we're actually doing, and making sure that that's realistic. We talk about minimums and adapting and adjusting as life changes. And so that idea isn't particularly new for me. But as I was picking my blackberries, I did start thinking about the fact that the way that I was taught to set goals was SMART goals. I remember learning about them when I was doing my personal training course, but I knew about them a long way before that. They're one of those ideas, I think, that just has always feels like it's been around. And just for those of you that don't know, SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. But if I'm completely honest with you, I would always in the past struggle to write my own version of this. Anyway, listening to these books did get me thinking about all of this again, because when I look at the things that I've actually achieved in my own life, I've normally had some idea of where I wanted to go. Like I've had a bit of an idea, but the route hasn't stayed the same. I've always learned things as I've gone along. I've had to change things. I've noticed that things haven't worked, that life has just happened. And then I've adapted and adjusted and I've kept going. So it made me think about SMART goals again and how we set goals in general. How well do they work? What does the research actually say about them? And are there any parts of them that are going to be useful? Are there ways that we can apply them that might be less useful? And what approach to setting goals could we use differently? So that's what I really want to talk to you about today. And it feels like a really apt time to be focusing on this because we're coming to the end of August. September is fast approaching. And I think for a lot of us, September can feel like a bit of a line drawn in the sand. It's like the 2nd January. The kids are going back to school. Summer's starting to wind down. Routines start coming back in. And like January, it can have that feeling of, right, I know what I need to do now. And it might be that for you, you've decided that you do want to lose some weight or lose some body fat. And it might be that that's something you've been thinking about for a while, but you just put it on hold over the summer, where you started to notice that clothes were feeling a little bit tighter. Maybe somebody took a picture of you and you've seen yourself in that picture, which is never a realistic view of what you actually look like, I might add. But it can be a reason why you've suddenly decided that you want to do something to change how you look. But at this point, one of the first things that you might do is you might download one of the tracking apps. Maybe it's NutriCheck or MyFitnessPal, but there's loads of these fat loss apps out there that do this. And it asks you your current weight. So you pop that in if you know it. If not, you make a guess. Then it asks you what your goal weight is. And if you're like I used to be, you'll likely pick a weight that is a weight you know you enjoyed being in the past. For me, I might have picked a weight that I was pre-children or in my early 20s because it's asking me what I would have liked, right? And then it asks you how quickly you want to lose it. It will give you options of like half a pound a week, 2 pound a week, 1 pound a week, and you pick one. And again, if you're like I used to be in the past, you will probably think the faster the better. Thank you very much. And you'll go for what, £2 a week. And then it gives you this lovely metric of you will reach your goal by the 20th of December. So within about 90 seconds, you've gone from, oh, I think I'd like to lose a little bit of weight to I will weigh this much by this date. And in theory, that is a SMART goal, isn't it? It's specific, it's measurable, it's got a deadline, making it time bound, it's textbook. Now, at this point, you haven't changed a single thing. You haven't eaten a different breakfast. You haven't done a workout. You aren't seeing how those calories are going to feel over time and how sustainable that might be for you. You just have this number and a date, and you've got them before you have any information that's actually going to be needed to make that prediction fairly sensibly. So a goal weight can be quite useful in that it can give you some direction, and tracking can be very useful, and knowing roughly what you're eating is often a thing that can make a huge difference for a lot of you. Being specific is going to be enormously helpful when it tells you what you're actually going to be doing. But what I'm interested in is what happens when the outcome and the date attached to it become the measure of what you're actually achieving, of whether you have indeed succeeded. It's the whole speed of it, how quickly that goal goes into a prediction, and then how easy that prediction can turn into the thing you end up judging yourself against. Because the number itself was never a promise, it was a guess, a reasonable guess based on some averages, assuming that nothing is going to change in that time. The thing is, by December, it's not so much of this prediction and guess, it's more something you're counting as a pass or a fail. And I wondered where SMART goals actually came from, because I realized I'd actually never been curious enough to ask. They were just something that were there, but they stem from a man called George Duran. And he wrote quite a short article in 1981 in a magazine called Management Review. And he was a corporate planning consultant. He was writing for managers who were struggling to write clear objectives for their different departments. And that is the context that the whole thing came out of. But there were a couple of other things that jumped out at me when I was looking into this. And the first is that the A didn't stand for achievable originally. It stood for assignable, which would be lovely, wouldn't it? Because what it meant was who's actually going to do this. And that does make sense when you're a manager writing an objective. And the second thing is that Duran said in the article himself that not every objective would need to tick all of the 5 boxes. And he never, ever claimed that any of it was based on psychology or behavior change research, because it wasn't. It was just a really practical advice for writing better objectives at work. And I think that in the context that he was actually writing it for, it was pretty sensible stuff. What is slightly interesting is how that bit of writing for managers who are writing departmental objectives has now ended up being the way that most of us are taught to want things for ourselves, to set our goals. It's gone a very long way from where it started. And of course, has now changed a bit along the way as well. And what I want to talk to you about today is whether any of it is actually fit for purpose. Now, the first S is specific. And I do use specificity all the time, just not quite in the same way, I don't think. Saying that I'm going to do 3 strength sessions a week, that I'm going to have protein at breakfast, that I'm going to be going to bed at this time, that I'm going to be doing shopping or a little prep on a Sunday. Those are all specific. And that is the point of them, because if it isn't specific, then I think we're unlikely to know what we're actually going to be doing. That is backed up by research. There are hundreds of studies, and they keep coming back to the fact that specific, challenging goals do tend to work better than vague ones, which is what he was trying to look at in his original writing of objectives. Because saying I'm going to try and eat healthily or I'm going to try and eat better is going to be doing far less for you than if you actually say exactly what you're going to be doing on what day. So I don't think it's that specific is an issue. I think it's just that we might have decided along the way somewhere that specific means something that it doesn't. Because I know for a lot of us, we'll see those SMART goals, we'll see specific, and we'll pick a weight. We'll say that we want to lose a stone, or that we want to get to a size 10, or that we want to be 10 stone. And these are the things that the apps have kind of trained us to do as well. That's what they're trying to produce. But saying 3 strength sessions per week is also specific. And I would argue that it's more specific because I can tell you exactly how that looks when it's done. I can measure that very easily. I can do 3 strength sessions. And if I don't do them, then that is largely going to be down to me and my week. But I cannot do 10 stone. There's no action available to me today called weigh 10 stone. I can do plenty of things that might make that more likely, but that thing itself isn't something that I can go out and perform. And if we think about somebody who's perhaps training for a marathon, who has already run 4 marathons, she knows what her times are in the past. She knows what her legs can do. She knows what 20 plus miles feels like. She knows what a heavy training week does for her. So if she says to you that she's going to go for a 3:45 marathon time in April, that's likely a very sensible number for her to be specific about. She's got quite a lot of years of information sat behind that, and she knows roughly what she has to do to get there between now and then. It's not just picked out of thin air. But now if you think about somebody who's never run before, they've never been further than the end of the road, and if she says she's going to run a 10K in 55 minutes by October, where has that number actually come from? It might be that she's seen a friend can do that and she thinks I should be able to. And therefore, she's not being silly. It's just that at the moment, she hasn't got anything to base that on yet. She doesn't know how her body's going to feel when she starts running. She doesn't know what her knees might feel like in week 4. And she doesn't know whether she's actually going to be enjoying it. But what she can do is get out 3 times a week, run a bit, walk a bit. And in 6 weeks, she's going to know a lot more about what she's capable of. And I think this also applies because I'm going to bring it back to how I change my goals with my running. If you've been fit in the past and you have got that running experience, but you perhaps lost a bit of fitness along the way, it's very easy for us to still pick those times. But that's not where we are anymore. And that was what I was doing to myself again and again, setting these goals, but based on a body that had been doing it consistently before and one that had lost a lot of fitness now. And that is where just making the specific, the amount of times you're getting out and focusing on feeling good for it is going to be far better than choosing a time and making it outcome based when you're just building it in again. But the point is that it is the same sport that we're talking about, and it might even be the same distance, but it's going to be a completely different question about how useful that goal is going to look for each of them. It's not that there's a wrong way of setting goals or one's doing it properly and the other one isn't. It's just that one of those runners is far more likely to be able to predict what she can manage and the other one can't yet. And that is what the research is saying as well, which is that a specific target on an outcome works best when it's something you already know how to do. And it's mostly a question of how much effort you can put in. When you're still working out the how, that target on the end result can actually pull your attention away from the working out because you're so busy watching the numbers. that you're not actually spending anything on figuring it out. Now, I'm quite aware that I made running analogies there, and you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, but if we're talking about fat loss, Ruth, I know how to lose weight. I have done it several times before, and I know that. And I don't think knowing is the issue. I think if we know, it would be easy to apply all the time, because the hard part isn't the knowing, it's the keeping on going when life inevitably is going to get in the way. It's knowing what we can do when shit hits the fan and finding options that are going to fit with life how it is now, rather than the one that we keep hoping we're going to have, that clear run, that quiet period that never actually seems to happen. Because when we're doing that, we'll find it for a bit and then we'll lose it for a long time and then find it for a bit. And it's this pattern that keeps repeating. It's a yo-yo cycle. But if we're thinking about that outcome, and we're not saying it's something we can perform, so we can't perform 11 stone or 10 stone, what do we put our attention on instead? And for me, I'm going to say actions. The actions, they're the things you can do each week or each day in the life that you're living, and you can change those as needed. They're the things that keep you moving forward to where you want to go. None of them are the outcome itself, but all of them are going to make the outcome more likely. Now, I know that if you've been listening for a while, you'll know this is what we do inside my membership, where we focus on movement, nutrition, mindset, and recovery. And in each one, we do look at the optimal version, which is the version that I give you. This is the ideal, what you might aim for. And then we'll also look at your minimums. We look at what can keep you going, like the if then that will keep you going when life isn't plain sailing, when life is just happening. But more than that, we focus on reflection, on looking at what is working, what isn't, what might need adjusting. And the reason that I mention it is that the emphasis isn't really on the goal setting bit at all. It's on the doing. It's on the paying attention on what is actually happening. And it's why regular reflection is always going to be encouraged. I would encourage it of everyone, because I know it's cheesy and I say it again and again. There is no failure, only feedback. And I think it's Seth Godin, I've mentioned him before as well, that he says, those who fail most win, because we want to learn from our experiences and what's happening. And if we take steps and general movement, for example, I don't know what your movement currently looks like. So there's no point me saying to you, get 10,000 steps a day or get 12,000 steps a day. What is going to be far more useful to you is looking at what you can actually do now, and then what might actually help you increase that a little bit so that you can work towards a higher number. I like to use a bit of a range here. You have your minimum, which is pretty much where you are. That's your baseline, but you push for more. You aim to get a little bit more, and you can look at that as an average over the week. We always aim for more when we can. And when I've been listening to Happy by Darren Brown, it's quite a long book, but it is worth a listen. There's a bit in it about tennis that I've been thinking about as well. And his point with this is that if you walk onto a tennis court thinking, I must win this, you're aiming for something that you don't fully control, because there is another person on the other side of the net and they are also wanting to win it and they get a say as well. So instead, you might go onto that court thinking, I'm going to play this as well as I possibly can. I'm going to give it my all. And that is something that you can actually deliver. You might still lose, but you can absolutely do the things you set out to do. And what he says is that you'll probably play better for it because you're not carrying the weight of an outcome that you can't guarantee. And when I was listening to this, I thought, oh, that's the same with weight loss, isn't it? You can want it a lot, but what you can actually deliver this week is the same as playing. And we're not the only one on the court, of course. And the other thing that is going to make a big difference, and there is a lot of research behind this one as well, is deciding in advance, not just what you're going to be doing, but when and where and what you'll do if something gets in the way. So not I'll train 3 times a week. So for me, it's I'll train on a Monday before I start work, a Wednesday before I start work, and a Friday at some point. That's how it might look. And if my training on Monday goes wrong, then I know that I can do a combined session on Tuesday. And we can take it even further than that. We can say on the days where I'm a bit more tired, I know that I can lower the intensity or I can use the different equipment, whatever it is out there. And the thing about this is it might sound like there's a lot to think about there, but it can be the difference between following through and not, because we're not making the decision in the moment when we're already really tired, when it's raining outside, when all we want to do at that moment is just sit down. When we've made the decision in advance, when you've sat with a cup of tea and your brain is fully switched on and dialed in, it's so much easier to commit to it. And I will bang on about making things easier, because I think when we list these things that we're trying to do as one big long job, I've got to go for a walk, I've got to go to the gym, I've got to prep my dinners. It all sounds like an awful lot. But when we think about doing things that are going to make the actions that we want to do easier, it all feels way more manageable. And that is going to be way more effective than just wanting it more. If getting your protein in is really hard, more willpower isn't going to be something that is going to suddenly mean that the fridge has what we need in it. But all of these plans are all well and good, aren't they? But life will inevitably happen. So yes, we might have decided we're going to train 3 times a week and it's going to be on the Monday, the Wednesday and the Friday. But then you sleep terribly on Sunday night and you're awake at 3, again at 4. Everything just goes sideways on the Monday. Maybe on Wednesday, your kid calls and they need collecting and you feel like you're then coming down with something. Whatever it is, life does happen. And then by Friday, you feel like you've only trained once properly. Have we failed? What do we do with that? Because there might be a side of you that looks at that week and sees it as a failure. I said I'd do 3 workouts. I did 1. Shit. Might as well just give up for a bit and we'll try again next week. And this is a story you've likely seen in other areas. I think we all know how that one goes. But there's also a side of you where you might look at that Friday and go, okay, what can I do now? Another example from the same book, Happy, I might add, which is the one I'm currently finishing at the moment, which is why it's fresh in my mind, is that you see it a bit like a game of chess, right? You sit down with a plan. They want to execute this plan when they're playing chess. But annoyingly, there is somebody on the other side of the board moving pieces around so that you're having to adjust your strategy the whole way through the game. And you have to. And I don't think anybody is watching a chess match and thinking, oh shit, they've changed their approach. They must be giving up on winning. We can see this as a bit of a metaphor for life. The other player is life happening. And it's not checking your calendar first to see what you had planned. It's just happening. And I think it's also important to note that at this stage of life, that other player is moving a lot more than it used to be. Because if you are in your 40s, your 50s and beyond, there is a fairly significant chance that you're dealing with things that you weren't years ago. You might be by now perimenopausal. You might not be sleeping so well. You might find that having a bad night's sleep is hitting way harder than it used to. You might have teenagers that want driving around. You might have elderly parents that you're trying to help with. You're probably at the peak of your career at work. And the amount that you're carrying in your head, that cognitive load is full. There's so many things that you need to remember now. It's more than it's ever been before. And that doesn't mean that we can't work with it. It's just that the plan that we're making on a Sunday has to be able to survive a week that didn't necessarily play out how we wanted to. We need to make sure that we're not building a plan that is only going to work for somebody who's got unlimited time, predictable energy, nobody else depending on her. It could be that you're building a plan for that early 20s version of you, where you only had yourself to look after and your free time was your free time. I'm going to use my business as a bit of an example here, because when I started working for myself again in 2024, I had ideas about how I wanted my business to go, how I wanted to build the program, etc. And what I'm doing now looks actually very different to what I started doing in 2024. And it wasn't because the original plan was stupid, but it was because I kept looking at what was working and what wasn't, what the women I work with actually needed, what I enjoyed doing, what fitted with my life. I mean, when I started, I had 3 different levels for coaching support. I had the workouts only area, and then all the way through to having more support. But what I noticed is that people who needed more support were all signing up for the lowest level. And then I thought to myself, well, actually, what I need to do is make sure that I have one level, make it the price of that lower level of support, but just make sure that those that want to stay just for the workouts only can stay for workouts only. But the women who are needing a little bit more guidance and support can get that. So it was trying to make it work for everyone, because we do learn as we're going along. And I'm sure that I'm going to keep changing things in the future from other things I learn. If I treated that first plan as a contract, I think I'd have been ignoring really useful information in order to stay loyal to something that I decided when I didn't have all of the knowledge that I have now. And it sounds strange that I would stick with the same plan, but it is often what we do when we're focusing on weight loss. I know that I would often think about fat loss and go, oh, I'll do that one because that worked for me before. But the fact it only worked for the 6 weeks I was on it or the 8 weeks I was on it didn't even cross my mind, because I saw diets as diets and the goal for the diet was that period of time only. I didn't think about how I could do it differently. I didn't know there was another way. There was no reflection, no learning from what worked or didn't work. But really, a plan is based on what we know right now. This seems like a sensible thing to try. Then we try it, we watch what happens, and we may well adjust. And you might notice that after a month, it's your weekends that always throw you off, or that you're absolutely fine until Thursday, or that the workout happens when you go before work. But if you wait until the end of the day, it never happens. None of those things are a goal. They're just information that we're taking on and we're using so that we can change what we do next. And that whole paying attention to what is happening and then changing what we're doing is a large part of how anyone gets anywhere. But the thing that I really like is that the changing the plan becomes the evidence that you've actually learned something rather than evidence that you failed. Woohoo! And of course, it's one of the reasons I like minimums, because if our optimal week is 3 strength sessions per week, your minimum might be 1, or it might just be that you're doing 1 round of that workout or setting a time of 15 minutes and doing as much as you can. The minimum isn't necessarily the goal. And this is very important to say. It's not what you're aiming for. You're aiming for the optimal as much as you can, but the minimum is there so that when the optimal isn't available, you're still doing something. You're still doing something that's keeping you connected to your goals, because your time, your energy, they're not going to be the same every single day. I know for sure that mine aren't. Some weeks I feel like I'm flying, and some weeks it feels so much harder. Definitely, I'm noticing more hormonal changes now that I'm 44. But there is, of course, a very obvious objection to all of this, that if we are focusing on adapting and adjusting and changing the plan when things don't go to plan, couldn't you just use that to get out of doing anything? Anytime it gets hard or you don't fancy it, just being really flexible, right? And yes, you could you could use it like that. But hard shouldn't be your signal to change something. If something's worthwhile, often to begin with particularly, it can feel a bit hard. It can take a bit of effort. And having a commitment to it does matter. Being able to do something that you don't feel like doing is also going to matter. And it is going to matter most on the days when nothing is going your way. And this is a point that Steve Magnus made in his book, Do Hard Things. And his whole argument is that we've got toughness a bit wrong. We think it means gritting your teeth and pushing through regardless of what we feel like we want. And what he actually says is that the real version is much more about being able to read the situation and respond well to it. It's where rigidly pushing forward is going to get swapped for the ability to adapt. And if we think about fat loss, it's when something isn't working, we have that instinct to do more. We feel like more is going to be the answer: more exercise, more restriction, following more rules, more discipline, cutting something else out. There might be situations and times where we do need to do a bit more, but very often doing more of what isn't working with more force isn't going to be the sensible response. So then when we're going back to am I just using this flexibility as a cop out to not do something? It's going to depend whether you're responding to the information or whether you're reacting to discomfort, whether you're changing something because you've learned something, or staying exactly where you are because changing feels hard, or changing the plan would feel like admitting that you got it wrong. And that's not always easy to tell apart in the moment. And there are a couple of things that can help with this. The first is going to be when you decided. So if you've already figured out on Sunday what your minimum is going to be for a harder week, you might already know the week is going to be hard. Then on Thursday, even when you're tired and busy, you've got a plan. That's when you're deciding. You're falling back to that minimum. If, however, you've got to Thursday night and at that point you're knackered, it feels like it's all gone wrong, then that is a bit different. It might still be the right call to skip that workout. It's just knowing whether it's a reaction to letting things get carried away with you, whether it's being upset about something that was never realistic in the first place, or something else. I'm all about choices over reactions, as many of you will know. And the second is where the effort went. So there's research about giving up on goals. And the useful bit here isn't about giving up on its own, just letting go of it. It's that letting go of something and then putting that effort into something else that matters to you is associated with people doing well. Letting go and putting it nowhere isn't. I could use my Duolingo example here. My New Year's resolution was to give up Duolingo because I realized I wasn't really learning a language anymore. And there's part of me that's a little bit disappointed with myself because it might well have been keeping me just thinking about doing Spanish, but I didn't replace it with something else, did I? No. I just gave up. But if we take it back to something a little bit more relevant, it could be that you didn't do your 3 workouts and you went out for a walk on Friday instead because that's what you had time and energy for. Or you might have not done your 3 workouts and the whole thing just evaporated. Time just got carried away with you. You felt a bit fed up, so you got out the takeaway menu. And that obviously is quite different. So you've got different versions. It's the if and then. If I can't do this, then I'll do that. So choosing not to do something, giving up on one goal, but then putting that time and the energy that you have available into doing something else that matters is going to feel far more rewarding. Now, all of this adapting is assuming that somebody is making your decisions. You might be listening and thinking, well, that's exactly what I don't want to do. I just have so much going on in my head. I don't have the energy to sit and make decisions. I just want somebody to tell me what to do, which I do understand, because when we are feeling tired and frustrated, we do think that that is going to be the most helpful thing. And it's something that does come up again and again. Just give me a meal plan. Tell me exactly what to eat. Tell me exactly which workouts to do. Tell me what I need to do to lose weight. And we do give you what you need to help you. And so that is completely normal to want that. If you're tired and you've got all of those other decisions going on in your day, then wanting one bit of your life where somebody does the thinking for you is completely legitimate. And that support is obviously worth having. And of course, I'm going to say that given what I do for a job. But what I give you is the information, the structure, the workouts, the recipes, ideas that perhaps you wouldn't have on your own. And I can hold you accountable and we can talk about what's actually happening, what might be going on, why things might be harder. And that is going to be useful because it is often very hard to see the patterns from your own perspective. And also, I do think that we often think we're the exception to the rule. But a coach isn't going to be there at 5:30 when you've got in from work and there's nothing in the fridge and you've got 40 minutes before you need to go out again and collect your kid. There's no one there to make that decision apart from you. I mean, there might be somebody that's thought about it for you, but when you're at that point, you're looking in that fridge door, that decision is going to be yours, whether you like it or not. And the other thing that I really feel strongly about with coaching is that I don't want you to become more and more dependent on me over time. This isn't about the coach becoming the hero of the story. What I want from my members is for them to get better and better at asking themselves, what is happening today? What is and isn't working? What could I actually change? What went well? What would I do next time? And this is the goal, really. And I know that it can sound like a lot, but you might find that you lean on your coach to begin with a lot more, or you lean on a group a lot more than you do later on. But with the goal of coaching isn't that you need your coach more. It's that you get good at doing it yourself. And that brings me nicely back to Duran again at the beginning and his assignable part. Because in a business setting, assigning an objective is going to make complete sense. Somebody has to do it, to own it. So you write down whose job it is to do that. But nobody can be assigned the job of changing your behavior. You can have a coach, a doctor, a trainer, a physio, a really supportive husband and family, a whole community of people doing the same thing. And I'd 100% recommend that you do all of those things. But the person inside the changing circumstances, making those decisions is still always going to be you. And that is the part that can't be completely handed over. And there is actually some research around this. There was a trial with a couple of hundred women and it was run over a year with a follow-up a few years later. So one group built a program around helping them find their own reasons and make their own decisions about how they were going to work out. The other got fairly standard health education. And the first group lost more weight and moved more. And when they looked years later to see if there were any patterns that predicted why any of it stuck, it isn't really motivation in general, and it isn't how badly you want it. It's more the kind of motivation and whether it was yours, actually yours. Nobody else can want it for you either, really. And Magnus in the book Do Hard Things puts this so well, so well. Something along the lines of autonomy being the switch that lets us persist. When you haven't got any control over what you're doing, you lose the ability to cope with it. Now, let's think about those weight targets, because there is this phrase that's used about targets like these, which is when a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure. And you might now start noticing that in loads of different areas, but the number goes in to help us. And then somewhere it becomes the thing that we're actually basing our success on, which we've spoken about already. But it is easiest to see with weight. So say that you did decide in August that you were going to be losing 28 pounds by Christmas. Then Christmas comes and you've lost 20. You might well be stronger than you were in August. Your clothes are fitting differently. You've got more energy than you had in the summer. You're eating in a way that doesn't feel like this huge punishment. And you've built some things that you really could just carry on doing indefinitely. But against the number that you wrote down in August, you failed. Shit. And that is where the damaging thoughts can come in, I would say, because that £8 gap could be what you end up looking at rather than the £20 that you actually lost. You'll look at the distance between what happened and what you predicted. And you've got to remember that back in August, you didn't know about any of what was going to happen over the next few months, really. And there is a danger that all of those incredible wins, the strength, the £20 you did lose, the energy, all of that just fades into the background. And this links kind of nicely to The Gap in the Game, which I've spoken about before, another book that is worth a read. And the gap is where you measure yourself against where you thought you'd be, or you measure yourself against an outcome. You're always measuring yourself kind of forwards, but you can also measure yourself against where you actually started and look at the progress you've made in whatever way that is. Maybe that is partly the weight that you're measuring and the progress there, but also you're looking at those other factors, how consistent you've been, your energy, your strength, all of those things as well. And that is the gain. But we can also look at another example of somebody else that said she was going to lose 28 pounds. So at the same time, in August, she said the same and she got there. Woohoo! But she got there and feels pretty miserable. She had to restrict quite heavily to get there. She turned down going out for dinners since September. She's trained even when she's felt exhausted. She's spent months waiting for this to end so that she can finally eat decent food again. This is not something she wants to keep doing. And I think we can guess how Christmas and January and February might well look for her. But against that original goal, she is the success and the other one is the lady that failed. So it really does make us think, what are we measuring? And you might say, well, she was silly to set a goal of £28. She should have just set a goal of £20 in the first place. Make it more realistic. And then you won't end up feeling like you failed. Just lower the number. And yes, that does sound pretty sensible. And obviously she would have met that goal. And a lot of weight management programs will actively talk about somebody bringing that number down to a number that they think is achievable. But when I actually went and looked at whether this is helpful, it doesn't really come down to being that simple at all. And there are studies that have followed people through weight management programs, and it asked them at the start what they were aiming for. And then when they look at what actually happened, what they repeatedly found is that how ambitious the goal was didn't predict how much weight came off. It also didn't predict whether people dropped out. So some of the researchers have gone as far as questioning whether it's worth talking to people about more realistic goals at all, which is often the standard practice. You know, I always think it's good to be realistic, but I don't tend to make the goals that we're setting outcome-based anyway. But the thing with all of this is it isn't unanimous. There are big studies of people using a digital program, and it found that people who preferred setting high goals were somewhat more likely to drop out. So there's a very mixed picture here. And the reason I think it's worth actually knowing this is because if talking somebody down to a smaller number isn't going to be reliably helping them, then the size of the number was never really the thing at all. Wanting more isn't the problem. Ambition can be a great thing to have. So we're not necessarily talking ourselves down. what is going to matter is what that number then does to you while you're working towards it. Is that number pointing you in a direction, or is it sat there as the verdict on whether the last however many months has stood for anything? Because that is two very different relationships with one number. And if we look at those two examples of that weight loss by Christmas, and both had a goal of 28 pounds, which 2 stone, the goal is identical, but what was different was the two ways that they actually executed that plan and what it cost them to get there, the things that they couldn't do, the other things that were important in life. And I think that is something that we often don't think about when we are focusing on our goals. And this was something actually I was chatting about with a friend recently, and how so many women will feel like thinness equals happiness. But you can then get to that thinner point in life, the thinnest you've ever been, and you think, oh, hang on a second, I don't quite feel like I'm there yet. And what I've learned over time is that often what we've done is we've focused on getting thinner and we've put so many other things on hold that we still don't feel fulfilled when we get there, because there's more to life that we value than fat loss and health alone. We have our family that we want to spend time with, friends that we want that social connection with. We have other things that we enjoy. But I also think that it is important to think about the goals we're setting as well. There's ones that were actually ours at some point, and then we've been carrying them around for so long that we've never actually stopped to see if they're actually what we'd choose now. And that can be that you've had a number in your head since you were 30. Maybe there's a size that you have been trying to get back to since before you had children, or you've been meaning to run a marathon now for 11 years. You don't actually particularly like running, but you feel like it's something you should do, or you should lose weight, or you should exercise 5 times a week, or you should look or be a certain way. But if you were choosing your goals today from all that you know now, knowing what life is like now, would you choose that goal again? And Darren Brown mentioned a question from a philosopher called William Irvin, and I'm trying to remember it exactly and get the idea right. But he basically said, imagine that everyone else around you disappeared. You're the only one left. Would you still want the same things that you wanted when the world was full of people? Maybe it's the car that you wanted, the house, the nice clothes. And the suggestion here is that a lot of it you wouldn't. You might find a house that's easy to look after, comfortable clothes, and you wouldn't necessarily be so fixated on what you look like. And if we were applying that to weight loss, fat loss, if nobody ever knew you'd done it, would you still want it? So a goal that involves other people can still be a really good goal, because we are social beings. We do care. I would love to say that every goal I set myself didn't take into consideration anyone else's things. But of course, we are human, and I do care what people think. And I do care what my family are doing. And I do care about how I'm portrayed. I think that is completely normal. But I think it's also important to just say, what's driving this change? Because when we pursue goals for reasons that are actually for us, rather than because we feel we should, because that's what other people are expecting us to do, we put in more sustained effort. We're more likely to get the results that we want. And that is actually quite interesting. And I've seen this before so many times with weight loss. And I'm going to use my sister as an example. I hope she doesn't mind. She had gained weight over quite a few years, and very well intentioned, my mum would quite often try and help her to give her advice on losing weight and tell her what she should be doing. But that didn't make her suddenly want to do it. The time that she actually decided she was ready to lose weight and made incredible progress and has kept off the weight, she actually had been suffering with a bad back, and she was fed up with that. And it took that reflection, that wanting to feel healthier, to have that kind of like, shit, is this how it's going to be if I don't lose the weight? To then decide that that was something she wanted to do. She didn't want to shout about it to the world. She just quietly then got on with focusing on those actions that helped her feel stronger. And she felt better and better for that. It was her goal. It only worked when it was her choice, not when other people were telling her to do it. But if I go back to that conversation I was having with a friend, and how we can feel quite flat even when we get to the goal that we set ourselves, and how often I think that that is because of all that we've given up to get there. And even when we feel like we've been doing everything quite sensibly, we might still find that it's taken over more than we intended it to. It might be that you're getting up much, much earlier and sleeping less than you had planned to, that you stop saying yes to certain things, and that hobby that you really enjoy that is just pleasure disappeared because you knew that strength training was important and you didn't have time to do Zumba anymore. I'm just using that as an example. Or that you're spending all of your mental energy on fat loss rather than on those around you at work or at home, and you're distracted by what you're going to eat or food when you're really wanting to listen to a conversation. And it's just a sign how easy it is for life to become a little bit smaller when we are pursuing goals aggressively, or not even aggressively, just single-mindedly. I guess we could just call it being on a traditional diet. Now, things that are worthwhile will often cost something. If we want to change, something's going to have to change. If you want to get strong, that is going to take time. If you want to change how you eat, that's going to take some attention and some effort and probably a few slightly awkward conversations with people when you say, oh, no, thank you. And that is often a deal that's worth making. And again, it comes down to choice of reaction. Are you choosing the trade that you're making, or are you reacting to saying no because you don't see any other option? And actually, Oliver Berkman did talk about this in The Antidote. There was a researcher, Chris Kays, and it explains why we find this so hard, because the more that we fixate on that endpoint, the more the goal stops being a target out there in the world and starts becoming part of our identity, who we actually think we are. It gets fully absorbed. And that is why letting go of a goal can feel so awful. It doesn't feel like changing your mind. It feels like giving up on who you always thought you would be. But what we sometimes forget is that life does change. You do change. What you want will change over time. Something that mattered enormously when you were 32 years old might not be the thing that is so important to you right now. And that's okay. And changing your mind, changing the goal isn't a sign of failure either. It comes back to what we said before. The effort instead is going to go to something that matters more to you at the moment. I'll often talk about how we can see fat loss, weight loss as a byproduct of changes that we'd want to make anyway to make us feel good. And I noticed that Darren Brown was talking about this with happiness. Happiness should be the byproduct of changes we're making anyway. And I was questioning, is that the same thing? And I went and had a little look. Is that the same thing? And what they've actually found is quite specific. And an example of this with happiness is those people who are constantly checking themselves against whether they are happy enough end up feeling worse. And it can show up most often when things are actually going fine. Say they're at a nice dinner with people that they really like, and part of them is saying, am I happy enough right now? Is this it? The measuring gets in the way of the thing they're actually measuring, if that makes sense. But there is another strand of research, and this is the bit that I think is more important. When people organize their days around doing things that tend to make them feel good, that goes the other way entirely. That's associated with more happiness and not less. So it's a difference between monitoring it and building a life that is tending to produce it anyway as a byproduct. And again, this is what I'm saying about fat loss. It's like you can't perform that outcome. What you can do are the actions that you'd want to do anyway, because you want to eat meals that are going to keep you full, plenty of protein, plenty of fiber. You want to move your body. You want to think about doing some resistance training. You want to make sure that you're recovering well, plenty of sleep. Perhaps think ahead a little bit so that you have a plan to make things easier, or doing one thing each evening to make tomorrow easier, and understanding that a biscuit is just a biscuit and you can choose to have it should you wish to. Those are things that, regardless of whether you have a fat loss goal, you may well be wanting to build in. Those are not characteristics of fat loss, but they will absolutely help with it. It's all about feeling good now before you worry about how quickly that number is moving. Make it feel good while you're changing, because it's so much harder to give up on things that have us feeling good. So more strength, more energy, food that feels a little bit more structured and less chaotic and reactive. And we want to be focusing on that recovery just as much. And we can feel like we're the person that's finally being looked after, and the person doing the looking after is ourselves. And then fat loss does happen as a byproduct, because those changes are things that were worth making anyway. And the outcome still matters. You're allowed to want to lose weight, and you can want it and you can measure it, and it's just that those shouldn't be the only thing that matters. The thing that's going to matter more is the things you're doing day to day, consistently, not perfectly, over time. So instead of using SMART goals, what should we do instead? And I would say this is where it's really good to have a direction, know roughly where you want to head, so you can have a bit of an outcome in mind, in the sense that you're like, I want to lose weight. That is definitely allowed. but then use that specificity where it's going to help you act. Not everywhere, not as this hard and fast rule that you can never break, but something that makes it a specific action that you can do. And then put most of your attention on the things you can do each week, because that is going to change from day to day, from week to week, rather than the outcome. Look at the progress you're making and how consistent you've been. And most importantly, think about how to make those things easier to do, because wanting to do them is one thing, but when it becomes that long list, it can feel a bit overwhelming. And you do want to have a bit of ownership. You want to know these are choices you've made. So it's not about outsourcing the whole thing. It's about having a little bit of guidance and knowing that ultimately you are the one that is in charge. Have a structure to follow that you aim for, but know what you'll do when you can't. And that's the minimums. If and then. I've spoken about these so much before that I won't go into more and more detail here. But if I can't do this, what is the smallest version of that that will keep you doing something? And pay attention to how these changes are making you feel. And that might include checking in with yourself regularly, thinking about what's working, what isn't. Are the goals still keeping you moving forward? Is what you'd planned to do still working for you? Is there something now that you might add in, or is there something you need to adapt? And the thing that I mostly want you to take away from this is that changing how you're approaching your plan isn't failing. That is how things work. We find something out and then we do something about it. That isn't you being flaky. It's the skill that we're learning to develop over time. So as we get towards the end of the summer and you start thinking about what you want to do next, you don't need this perfect plan. You just need somewhere that you're headed, a few things that you can actually do this week. I mean, and if you are starting from the beginning, pick one thing. I'm going to have a high protein breakfast each day this week, or 5 out of 7 days. You're looking to improve on where you are with a specific target in mind. And of course, if you would like some help with achieving your goals, then I would love to see you inside the Ruth McFit app. Membership at the moment is currently closed. We are opening early for those on the wait list at the end of the month. And that gives those of you that are in early 20% off your first month, as well as an opportunity to start thinking about how things work for you, because we'll then be kicking off altogether on the 7th of September. It is a fab option if you want some structure, you want some guidance, you want some support, and you want to be part of an incredible community. I will put the link to the waitlist in the show notes. But if you have any questions at all, please do let me know. You can either email me, ruth@ruthmacfit.com, or you can reach me on Instagram or Facebook. It's at ruthmacfit. I am always happy to chat. Thank you very much. Goodbye.